At 4:17 in the morning on July 7, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien crouched inside his shallow command post on the open sweep of Tanapag Plain on Saipan, peering through field glasses into the last black minutes before dawn while radio static hissed behind him, and at 38 years old, with weeks of grinding combat etched into his posture. He commanded the 1st Battalion of the 105th Infantry Regiment, a unit holding what everyone believed was the final, thinning edge of a defeated enemy, because for 3 relentless weeks his men had pushed the Japanese defenders northward cave by cave, bunker by bunker, burning them out of limestone hollows and collapsing their fighting positions until intelligence officers assured him that only a few hundred survivors remained trapped against the island's northern cliffs, starving, wounded, and exhausted, and the brass had told him plainly that the worst was over, that resistance was collapsing under its own weight, that what remained was cleanup rather than battle, which was why the artillery of the 10th Marines had been dug in only 400 yards behind his foxholes, 12 105mm howitzers arranged in 3 tight batteries close enough to provide immediate support, yet far closer to the front than doctrine recommended, because doctrine said artillery was never placed that close unless desperation demanded it. And no one believed desperation still existed on Saipan, not with enemy ammunition dwindling, morale shattered, and prisoner interrogations estimating fewer than 800 effective Japanese troops left alive on the entire island, most of them sick or wounded, while O'Brien's own casualties had fallen sharply in recent days to little more than scattered sniper fire and occasional mortar rounds, so much so that the Marines manning the guns had begun quietly discussing rotation dates and homebound rumors. And yet something in the silence that morning felt wrong, a heaviness O'Brien had learned to recognize in the Pacific, the way sound carried differently over open ground, the way stillness sometimes meant preparation rather than defeat, and at 4:15 he found himself lifting his glasses instead of his coffee while behind him clerks updated acetate overlays and radio operators murmured routine reports that all suggested a winding down sector. But as 4:30 passed, the faint sounds drifting from the north were no longer random jungle noises, not the isolated rustle of a patrol, or the nervous movement of retreating men, but something rhythmic, coordinated, and growing, and Sergeant Thomas Baker, listening from his foxhole, recognized it instantly as something far larger than a probe, because he had learned in earlier campaigns how Japanese attacks usually unfolded, and this carried the unmistakable cadence of mass movement. And when reports filtered in at 4:35 of shadowy figures moving across a broad front 600 yards out, O'Brien hesitated before ordering illumination, because this did not match the behavior of an enemy on the verge of collapse. And by 4:40 the whispers had turned into raised voices, chants carried on the humid air, the unmistakable sound of thousands of men shifting equipment and advancing together, and as the eastern horizon began to pale, the truth arrived all at once at 4:45 when the darkness ruptured into motion and noise as more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers burst from the tree line and charged straight across Tanapag Plain in the largest banzai attack of the Pacific War. Not the 800 O'Brien had been told to expect, but virtually everything the enemy had left. Regular infantry, sailors, wounded men supported by comrades, and even civilians gripping sharpened bamboo spears, moving as a single human tide that seemed to shake the ground itself. And O'Brien watched in disbelief as bayonets caught the first light of dawn, and the machine guns of 1st Battalion opened fire in disciplined bursts that should have annihilated any conventional assault, tracers stitching lines through dense ranks, men dropping by the dozens. Yet the charge did not slow because the gaps filled instantly as if the dead were irrelevant, and within minutes the sheer weight of bodies began to force openings between American strongpoints, especially through the 400-yard gap between battalions that doctrine said should have been manageable against a weakened foe. And as Private First Class Morrison burned through ammunition at a rate no range training had prepared him for, firing hundreds of rounds into masses so thick he could not miss, Japanese soldiers began slipping around the flanks and flowing through low ground, some armed with rifles, others with swords, many wounded but determined to reach the American line. And behind the infantry, the artillery crews of the 10th Marines, heard the small arms fire surge from a crackle to a roar as batteries opened pre-registered defensive missions. 105mm shells screaming overhead and bursting among the attackers with devastating effect, bodies torn apart in flashes of steel and dust. But even that failed to break the assault because the charge was no longer tactical but existential, gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel. And within 5 minutes O'Brien realized his plan was collapsing as Japanese soldiers penetrated through to the rear areas and surged toward the gun pits themselves. And when the first attackers reached the artillery line at 5:05, the Marines manning the howitzers were forced into a decision no manual had ever covered, because their guns were elevated for indirect fire and useless at point-blank range. And as enemy soldiers swarmed over the low ridges meant to protect them, Captain Reynolds ordered the unthinkable, dropping gun tubes to minimum elevation and cutting time fuses to seconds, turning the howitzers into massive shotguns that fired directly into charging men at distances measured in yards rather than map coordinates. And when Sergeant Kowalski's crew fired the first direct round, the shell burst just above the attackers' heads and erased an entire swath of the assault in a blinding flash. But still the survivors came, and the battlefield dissolved into chaos as overlapping direct fire from artillery mixed with machine guns, rifles, pistols, and hand-to-hand combat amid choking cordite smoke, and crews fought with entrenching tools and bare hands when ammunition ran out, while Private Collins swung his shovel to protect a breech mechanism, and wounded men continued to crawl forward refusing to stop, and for 37 minutes the gun line became the front line. 2 batteries temporarily overrun and retaken at staggering cost, yet the direct fire from 12 howitzers created a killing field unmatched in the Pacific, bodies carpeting the approaches in dense layers that slowed even the most determined attackers. And when the main assault finally spent itself just before 6, O'Brien surveyed a battlefield that had barely held, with over 400 of his own men dead or wounded and thousands of enemy bodies scattered across the plain. But the fighting did not truly end because small groups of Japanese soldiers continued infiltrating throughout the morning, appearing suddenly from shell holes and wreckage, forcing isolated, brutal engagements that defied all tactical logic. And Sergeant Baker, isolated in a crater with no ammunition left, fought with pistol and shovel until overwhelmed, while Captain Benjamin Salamon's aid station became a fortress by accident when wounded men drew attackers to it, and the doctor, bound by oath to preserve life, was forced to kill with clinical precision to protect his patients, firing methodically until the ground around him was littered with bodies. And it was not until reinforcements from the 27th Infantry arrived after 8:30 that the remaining resistance was systematically crushed, gun pit by gun pit, foxhole by foxhole, until by 10:45 the plain fell silent except for fires and the moans of wounded men, and then began the counting, a task almost as psychologically devastating as the battle itself, as soldiers moved methodically across Tanapag Plain marking bodies with chalk, recording details that blurred distinctions between soldier and civilian, combatant and wounded, discovering that many of the dead bore old injuries, disease, or starvation marks that suggested they had been dying long before the charge. And as conflicting reports emerged, some counts exceeding 4,000, others suggesting far fewer actual participants, the administrative machinery of war struggled to impose numerical certainty on chaos, ultimately settling on a figure that satisfied reporting requirements while acknowledging uncertainty. And as bulldozers arrived to bury the dead in long, unmarked trenches, survivors like Morrison and Salomon carried scars that statistics could not capture, because the battle had shattered assumptions about enemy collapse, revealed the terrifying capacity for organized desperation, and forced American planners to confront the reality that future island battles would not end cleanly but in paroxysms of violence where doctrine failed and survival depended on improvisation. And in the months that followed, as Saipan became a launch point for bombers aimed at Japan itself, the memory of Tanapag Plain lingered as a grim lesson that overwhelming firepower could defeat even absolute determination, but only at a human cost so immense that no casualty figure, however carefully recorded, could ever truly explain what had happened in the half-light before dawn on July 7, 1944.